Okay, thank you, Emily, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our session today on finding the right words, co-creating metadata for an OER repository. We'll be sharing about our experiences as a team of librarian and student collaborators. Next slide, please. So we're coming at you today from the heart of the Salish Sea bioregion on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Lummi and Nooksack peoples. You can see the Salish Sea here. It's the bioregion that includes the inland marine waterways of British Columbia and Washington State and their watersheds. We are all here in Bellingham, and our host, amazingly, is also in our bioregion, which is very cool. My name is Neah, and I am the Teaching and Learning and Community Engagement Librarian at Western Washington University.
Hi, I'm Rowena McKernan, she, her pronouns, and I am the OER librarian for Whatcom Community College in Bellingham as well.
And I'm Bianca. I'm a recent graduate from Western Washington University, and I'm pursuing work in the field of disaster risk reduction.
I'm Leo, he, him pronouns, and I'm a student at Western Washington University studying history and women, gender, and sexuality studies.
Thanks, everyone. Next slide, please. So our plan for this session is that Ro and I are going to start off with some context, and then we'll pass it off to Bianca and Leo for the bulk of our time. They're going to speak to learning about the significance of descriptive metadata, as well as the bigger picture of how contributing to a place and land-based learning project has affected them. Then we'll have time for questions at the end, and we're really eager to hear what your questions are about this work that we're doing. So please, you can drop them in the chat as they come up or save them for the end, and we'll be sure to save time at the end to respond. Next slide, please. So how did we come to work as co-creators? I'm going to pass things off to Ro to get us started by sharing about the Salish Sea Curriculum Repository.
So, greetings, everyone. We're from the Salish Sea region, Bellingham area, but we're curious where y'all from. So not like your city-state, but your bioregion that you live in. So, for example, the Great Lakes or the Caribbean or Hudson Valley, or if you're from outside of North America, if you want to share with us which bioregion that you live in, we'd love to hear from you. You can just drop that in chat. So the Salish Sea Curriculum Repository, which is the repository we're going to be talking about today, was created, and maybe that's on the next slide. Okay, I had to advance my own slide. This is what the repository looks like, and there's a QR code there for you all to, if you want to check out the live version currently. So what's great about this repository is that it was created in a low-cost way using open source software. So it's built on a piece of repository software called a MeKS that we were able to install and configure on a shared server, which kept the cost of creating this extremely low. It doesn't require a lot of resources to do it. And so we're able to use the software to develop lessons, resources, and courses about the Salish Sea throughout our bioregional colleges and universities. So Canadian American, across that geopolitical line, because we're in one bioregion. The Salish Sea Curriculum Repository includes OERs and an index of curated resources from instructors that teach courses to students about this area that we live in. Contributors and users come from a wide variety of bioregion institutions. I'm in a community college, Neah's in a university, so this is cross-institutional as well. So actually, talking a little more about our institutions, Whatcom Community College, we're the institution that is administrating the software and hosting it. And then, Neah, do you want to talk about Western for a minute?
Sure. So yeah, we're Western Washington University, just across town. And one of the interdisciplinary programs here at Western is the Center for Canadian American Studies that works with the Salish Sea Institute, and they've been big supporters and collaborators on the building the repository. And they wrote a grant that we were included in a little bit of funding to support work on the repository.
Yeah, so this small amount of funding, it's from a Title VI grant from the U.S. Department of Ed. And so, with money, sometimes if you don't spend it, it goes poof, but it's also it's a smaller amount, right? So you can't do big things with that. It's not going to happen. So what we got together and we thought about it, what can we do with this? What would be of value? And we decided what would be of value was bringing on student employees to not only provide some employment and job experience for some students, but we're able to harness their talents to help us write descriptions for the resources in our curriculum repository. So a lot of the material in the repository was created via spreadsheet upload. So, it might have title creator, but it might have a minimal description or no description, or it might be written in a way that doesn't mesh well with the way the Omeka S works. For instance, the Omeka S, when you're browsing, it displays the descriptions, but only the first 2 or 3 lines are really visible. And so what we really needed to do was hire these students to write or rewrite our descriptions, front loading that information on top. And they'll talk more about that. And also training them to provide that keyword-rich, plain language summaries and cleaning up some of the metadata on it that came in through auto uploads. So this has worked out really well. We've had a great experience working with our students. So far, we have brought in 3 undergraduate students altogether. Bianca in the summer of 23 worked about 10 hours a week for 4 weeks, and we were able to extend their position by a couple weeks. The other 2 that included Leo, who we'll hear from shortly, worked together just during this past spring and summer of 2024. So they were working a few hours a week over a 10-week quarter, while also taking classes and sometimes working other jobs. So they're amazing. In terms of concrete outcomes, the 3 positions have helped us write and update 232 of the item descriptions, including linking and mapping items within the repository. Neah?
Great. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat that takes you to some documents like the job description and application that we used, as well as the detailed work plan for the student position. They're also linked from the QR code on that slide. So take a look at those documents for some more specifics about how we structured the position. But I will highlight a few things. So meetings were really important in establishing our relationships with each other as collaborators on this project. So the position really draws on relational cultural theory around the importance of our quality of time together and encouraging ourselves to be imperfect and to grow and ask questions. So having those face-to-face meetings that weren't very agenda-driven was really important, as well as having check-ins that were convenient. So some of them were pre-scheduled and others were as needed. If somebody said, hey, I need to check in with you, we tried to be available. And sometimes that meant dropping into my office or maybe setting up something online or on the phone. We also really sought to hire people who would gain a lot from the experience and be motivated to work independently. So some of the training that we offered was self-paced, most of it. We shared resources to read or watch, and then we would chat about them together. All of the links to those readings are in the documents, and they're on the next slide as well. Ro, if you just want to advance, we can show that and then maybe pop back to this one in a minute. But yeah, we wanted to provide context around not only what is metadata and how do you go about writing things for like when you only have so many characters, but also some of the things important to the content in the repository around how are we citing Indigenous knowledge holders and referring to tribal nations and that kind of thing. So can you go back one slide, please? Thank you. And then when it came to writing and editing, we used a scaffolding approach, the I do, we do, you do. So this meant that first, included in the training materials that we had examples of a first and second draft of writing a summary. It was annotated with comments to explain my metacognitive process as I went about writing the description and then deciding what detail to include. And then also when I came back to it to edit it, what decisions did I make about what information to include or take out and why. So that was the I do. Then we turned it over to students so they could work on writing 2 summaries. We showed them the items in the repository and asked them and the guidelines for, character length and that kind of thing. And then asked them to take a go at it. Then we would meet for 30 to 60 minutes, so a pretty in-depth meeting to talk through their process, how they went about it, what questions came up, what edits to offer, and that kind of thing. So that was the we do. And then after that, students worked on writing in batches of 10, and then they would either send them to me for editing, or when Leo and Heather were working together, we had them edit each other's work, and then they moved on to adding them to the repository. Which brings me to the last piece of the puzzle, which was the Omeka S training. So we did this as a 3-hour in-person session a few weeks into their time with us. And they went to Rose Library at the community college and sat down and worked with her side by side for about 3 hours so that they could get a little bit of training, do some hands-on work, ask questions, and then keep going. And then now we're going to turn it over to Leo and Bianca, and they will talk about how they experienced all of this.
I'm Leo. I helped work on the repository last spring. Before being part of this project, I had actually never heard the term metadata, and I believed in the importance of accessibility to information. As somebody who is studying history, I see a definite disconnect between all of the incredible things I get to learn about in the scholarly world and what the average person has access to on a day-to-day basis. But it was one thing to hold that value and another to see how that happens in a digital space and get to go behind the scenes and see what goes into making things findable. And then once you've found them, what makes it accessible. If you want to move on to the next slide. This is a screenshot of a resource in Omeka S where we would input the metadata, and then that same resource in the repository itself, so where it would be viewable to teachers, learners, general public. And I circled in red the values tab, which is where we would put in the title, the description itself, any relevant information such as the creator or the date, and then circled in red as well, where that appears in the actual source in the repository, as well as the media tab, which really varies resource to resource. But for this one, the resource is a documentary, and so we linked that. And then the mapping tab, which I think was a really cool feature, especially for the nature of this material being about place-based learning. And all relating to spaces within the Salish Sea. I think that was really fun to put in there, and then in the repository makes it, not only adds another piece of information for these sources, but then also another way to find them, and for people who are looking through this to figure out what would be relevant to what they want to teach. And the other thing about this is when you look in the repository and look at a specific resource, you can see the full description there. But as Ro mentioned earlier, when you're just browsing, you only see the first couple lines. So Ro, if you want to go ahead and move on to the next slide. We also got to learn a whole new unique form of writing for this project. I really got to learn how to make information concise, clear, accessible. If you want to go ahead and go on to the next slide, you can see here that it just shows that those first few lines of the description. And so figuring out how to front load information, how to keep the audience in mind, because most of the people that are going to be looking through this will be educators in the Salish Sea that are teaching about the bioregion. And so what might they already know? What would be relevant to them? What are they looking for when looking through these sources? Remembering that above all else, it is not an essay. It's not something that needs to be verbose or flowery or like perfectly get a point across the correct way, but rather it's a tool. And that I'm not going to be the last person that looks at a given description that I write. That it's a collaborative effort, and the more eyes, the better, working together to make things as clear as possible. That was especially neat getting to work alongside Heather, because the two of us together were able to look at each other's descriptions and give each other feedback. And that I think really contributed to my understanding of this as a collaborative effort. It also was neat to do work after Bianca and be able to go back and look at the descriptions Bianca had written. And I learned that, rather than trying to tackle it myself, that just never being afraid to ask questions. I feel like the more that I asked questions and was curious about things up front, the more I felt confident about things as the process went along. And yeah, remembering that I could always go back and revisit things later. Yeah, Bianca.
Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as the first student writer and being a position as the only writer at the moment, I had a lot of established regular communication with Ro and Neah, and we created that system for receiving and implementing feedback as I did training and developing resource descriptions. It felt very comfortable as a student working with these two extraordinary librarians, and I didn't feel out of place when I asked a bunch of questions, and it was really invited into the process in every step of the way. The whole process of writing descriptions and problem solving on McKernan felt very collaborative, and I knew that my input and perspective was appreciated along the way. I quickly learned how much care and effort goes into repository and web development, so resources can be easier to find, to use, and connect. Using a McKernan was my first experience of directly interacting with the backdrop of how information in libraries is organized and collected, and I enjoyed seeing how this process worked, the effort it takes to make these resources more accessible, and this puzzle of researching and describing and mapping and citing resources. As I gathered experience in writing descriptions and using a McKernan, I noticed my own progress and improvement, and it also felt like this task was infinite and super important. So I was glad that I got to take on the work, and I was glad to hear that students were coming after me to get to also have this learning experience and help keep this repository growing. Next slide, please.
I ended up developing my own approach, just to make the process easier for myself when writing descriptions. The kind of independent material that we looked over about web writing, about metadata, that kind of gave us more insight into this approach to writing, contributed to my understanding, as well as just kind of working through the first description, bouncing ideas off of Ro and Neah. And once I'd written a couple descriptions, I just sort of created a little map for myself of that I, more or less would follow for the rest of them. So first, I asked myself, what is this? Is it an article? Is it a dissertation? Is it a documentary? In the most basic sense, what is it about? What is it telling the audience? And then the who, the subject of the piece, which could be the author, but sometimes the author is not the most important part. Maybe it's a particular tribe or nation or a group or organization. The when could be the date that it was published, but sometimes that isn't relevant at all. Maybe it's a treaty that the year that a treaty was written that is relevant to the piece. And then the where, which oftentimes is relevant, being as it's place-based learning. But then again, keeping the audience in mind, I could assume that generally audience members would have a basic idea of the geography of the Salish Sea region. So knowing that, what about the where would be relevant to them. And then just making sure that, my few sentences of description gets across the why, so that when people are looking at this, they can figure out why it might be relevant to them, and what they're trying to teach.
Yeah, so as we've touched on a few times, an important aspect of our experience as writers for the repository was the learning we experienced through researching resources. Similarly to the purpose of providing this resource repository for students and instructors to study the Salish Sea, we also experienced this place-based or land-based learning. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Uh-oh. Okay, cool. As Neah and Ro explain in their paper, Omeka S repository for place and land-based teaching and learning explained that the ERIC descriptor place-based education is described as pedagogy to engage learners in their cultural, social, and ecological context. It often includes inviting community members in as instructors and bringing learners into the natural environments where they live. While place-based education is the prevailing term, Calderon has argued that the expression of this term has typically erased Indigenous relations with land and obscures the violence of settler colonialism. In contrast, Calderon writes that land education or land-based education makes explicit the ideologies and structures of settler colonialism, and that land education centers Indigenous peoples' relations to land, critically examining what it means to inhabit the lands of Indigenous nations. So, straight from the beginning, the foundations of the repository, the training we as writers received about citations and developing resources and descriptions, and what we wrote kept these contexts in mind as we worked. Next slide, please.
So doing work that is essentially about place-based learning, I learned so much. I think all of us shared this experience, all of us student workers, about the land that we live on, about the places that we visit and that we explore in this bioregion, which really increased my own sense of place and sense of connection to my surroundings. I have a picture up here of my girlfriend and I just on a hike, and so many times when we have gone on a hike or to a park, we'll see something that will make me think of some of the work that I did for this repository. Like now I know how to identify camas plants, and harvesting camas roots is an indigenous practice in this region that is significant to food and to medicinal practices. There's a picture as well of my mom and my sister when my family and I visited a waterfall where there was an informational plaque about how there had once been a dam there, and the dam had since been taken down, and sort of the positive ecological impact that had. And then I ended up having a whole interesting conversation with my family about dam removal projects, which is another thing that I helped write about for the repository. So that was just like really cool to be able to draw connections between the work that I was doing and just the spaces that I inhabit around me. I think it was really enriching personally, and it also just emphasized the importance of the work that we're doing, and how that is going to be able to provide those connections for so many people who are using this information. Go ahead and move on to the next slide. It also was wonderful to be able to build relationships through this work, to be able to work across campuses. There's here a picture of the rooftop of the Whatcom Community College Library. which we got to visit, which was absolutely gorgeous. I had not actually been to Whatcom Community College until doing this work, but I have visited the library since, just because it's such a lovely space. And then I have spent a lot of time in Western's library, but our very first meeting, we went on a little field trip down to the map collection, and that was my first time visiting that space. And I think even though so much of this work was independent and remote, which was really, a cool opportunity to learn how to schedule my own time and to do independent work and research, to still be able to have that aspect of relationship building and fostering this sense of environment made me, first of all, so much more comfortable to ask questions throughout, because I felt like those lines of communication had already been established and I felt comfortable with the people that I was working with. But it also, it made the work that I was doing feel so much bigger than just, me and my little laptop and keyboard, and made me feel like the work that I was doing was significant and had this sense of connection to it. And if you want to move on.
Speaking of these connections in between what we're doing and who we're working with and who this is for, I was invited to a Salish C 201 faculty meeting in the summer in order to meet the people who teach the courses that the repository supports at Western Washington University and Whatcom Community College. My listening in on their conversation about the future of the Salish C minor, collaborations between academic institutions, and hopes for student learning helped me frame the way I thought about my resource description writing as I was going. Mentions of the role of the repository and how faculty used it reiterated the purposes that I had learned about already. And since the Salish C studies courses are so multidisciplinary, faculty mentioned how the repository is a good place for resources when teaching about a discipline that the instructor might not be as familiar with. I liked getting to know where the instructors are at and their intentions to work together and brainstorm ways to make the courses in minor better. Seeing how the repository is built and functions showed me how just awesome this tool is. And I know that the repository will continue to advance, not just for instructors, but also for students and community members looking for ways to acquire knowledge about the Salish Sea and understand its complexities better. What I found most remarkable about the repository is the collaboration between these two academic institutions. Studying the Salish Sea highlights how seemingly separate aspects of this region all interact and support each other. And so this interinstitutional partnership echoes that linking of varying aspects to develop a broad and open access resource. And since work in this repository will only grow from here on out, I look forward to watching its growth and increase in possible opportunities for other students to participate in this work. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Bianca, and thank you, Leo, for sharing all about your experiences. For the rest of our time, we're hoping to hear questions from everybody who's come to join us today. So feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourselves and let us know what you're wondering about. There was one earlier question about the grant funding, how much money did we receive? So the grant includes $1,500 annually to support work on the repository. So for the last 2 years, we've used that funding straight to supporting, I shouldn't say supporting because to hiring these student workers who are here with us today, along with one other person who could join us. Bianca and Leo, while we're waiting to see if anybody has other questions, and oh, here we go. We've got one. Okay. Um, has the student employee model been extended to other projects?
Not yet,
Um,
not yet.
not yet. Yeah.
So we got a
Um,
couple more years of funding. So there may be other projects around this that we may want to hire students for.
yeah, and I feel like it's interesting to think about it as a model as Bianca shared, like when they were working with us, it was the first iteration of this approach. And and it feels kind of like an open education project in that Bianca wrote a reflection at the end of their time, which was one of the readings that Leo and Heather started with. And then Leo wrote a reflection at the end of his time, which then future students will also read, as well as, sharing this recording. So yeah, I think we want to keep it going for the repository and absolutely share this approach that they are co-creating with us as well, very much through their feedback about the project, the work plan and that kind of thing. Yeah, Abby, I saw your question about the job description recruitment process. We shared a link. I'll add it again. And then let us know if you have other questions.
From Ellen, are any of the students or any Bianca and Leo, are any of you guys thinking about going to library school after this?
I like the idea of it. I have, the usual instinct of wanting to go in so many directions in so many different ways. I know that library work will always be on my mind, and I'll find ways to weave it into what I do. Uh, so it's not out of the question. It's just not on the next path, though I've gotten to work with so many librarians, so I know how awesome they are.
Similarly, I want to do so many different things. I'm working toward a double major bachelor's degree right now, and I think after that I have a lot of different ideas and have yet to see where things lead me, but that's definitely an interest of mine. And I think at the very least I'm currently looking a lot into public history, which I think there's a lot of overlap there. And so I might end up going in that direction, but at the very least, I think no matter what I do, it's going to use a lot of the same skills and hopefully overlap with a lot of the same people and institutions. Because I already was vaguely interested in it, but got to learn even more about library work. Met some awesome librarians through this job.
Thanks, you
And I'll
guys.
say that, oh, sorry. Um, Heather, wasn't able to join us, is also going into like museum work. And so we know that these are really transferable skills, to a lot of different fields. And that's exciting. But yeah, Leo, Bianca, come be librarians with us. Um, and then Ro, maybe I'll take the question about other institutions, and then if you want to grab the one on
Yeah.
submissions. Um, so yes, there are other institutions that work that are teaching Salish studies. We've throughout the life of the repository over the last 4-ish years, there's been all these different again, relationship building, network building gatherings around Salish studies. Western and Whatcom are really the institutions that have this very specific curriculum and minor that we share an intro course and that kind of thing. But at the wider meetings, what we found is that folks throughout the bioregion are interested in the resources shared in the repository and how they might adapt them at their institutions. So we have one page on the repository where you can find like sort of the educator network. So there are people on both sides of the US-Canada border and from different institutions who are connected and whose works, who are submitting materials. And I'll just acknowledge that there is sort of this, it's very much grounded in the way that we are teaching at our two institutions right now.
Yeah, and the materials submitted, the curriculum materials, they have been coming mostly from the instructors who are using them actively in their pedagogy. But Anybody could also submit a resource. It's open for submission. So it, and maybe an instructor will see it and incorporate that resource into their curriculum. So it comes from both ends. There's a couple different submission forms there. One submission form is definitely geared toward instructors and the types of questions a faculty would want to know. And then the other is just a more open-ended contributor resource form. So thank you for those questions. Thank you, Heidi.
We love hearing what this is connecting to in your work as well. So if you feel like sharing, some of you have said, oh, I might share this with my students or whatever, please let us know what is resonating, what's connecting, what's familiar, what's something that you might use. Have you made your student training materials available? Yeah, we shared the link to the Google Drive, and that's really the materials. Everything's linked in there. I think there's a couple documents that if you click on them, you might need to request access, which you're welcome to do. And Ro, I think, or me, whoever owns the document, will do that for you. Thanks for sharing that link again. And then Christine or anybody else interested, if you have if you want to know more, please, of course, get in touch with us. And Ro, if you advance to the next slide, our contact info is there. Our slides, I think, are available through Sketch. And yeah, we definitely want to hear from y'all. So please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Yeah, I think this is kind of the end of our session. Our time's up. But we're going to be hanging around in this room for a bit. So if you wanted to stay, unmute yourself, ask a question, or continue to drop questions in chat, that